iPad?
No, I don't think so. I hope not.
Do you have your phone?
I have my phone.
Can you call me if you need it?
Yeah,
I will bring
Yeah.
it.
Yes.
Okay.
Well, there are two people here.
Ja,
How are you?
geht alles gut. Bin,
Ist alles gut?
ich wollte nur sehen, ob alles klappt. I just wanted to check if everything is fine and then I can. Yeah, just doing my reading. So
I don't know if you got-
is your son still in Austria?
Yes, in Salzburg.
Oh yeah. Oh my goodness. You must have visited him there.
Yes, about 2 weeks ago.
Oh, really? Yeah, it's just such a beautiful city.
Oh, it is. It is a wonderful place.
Yeah, yeah.
And then we went to Vienna for 3 days.
Oh, Vienna. Yeah. Actually, I tell you, we went to Vienna, my husband and I, and at the time when Khrushchev and President Kennedy met in the 60s, and we sort of came and it was all police and this and that, but it was interesting. But it was what a beautiful city.
It is.
And
It's
to see the
wonderful.
opera and the opera place. Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
And Mary, of course, joined us, and she's in our choir, and she's our soloist. We have a famous singer here sitting here.
Hi there.
Right.
I-
Hi.
I lived in Vienna for about 4 months when I was in college.
Oh, yeah.
So I have a soft spot in my heart for Vienna.
Did you ever go
Yeah.
to Budapest as well while you were in Vienna?
Well, yeah, I did, but just for a few days. It was
Uh-huh.
a student tour. Yeah, it's a very pretty city. But this
Yeah.
was back in the 70s, and it was still, it was still Iron Curtain.
But Hungary had like a Gulag communism. They just did their own thing all the time.
Yes.
Which was good. And without them, a lot of things would never happen. But that's, yeah. We all can travel again soon.
Hopefully.
And now we can do armchair. You traveled, but many people now go again. It's great.
Well, it was nice because there weren't that many people, and
Yeah.
almost no Americans. And at least in Austria, I only heard English 4 or 5 times. And usually you're surrounded by
I know.
Americans, but that was not the case. And
Mhm.
the trip was fine. And they have it much better controlled than we do about COVID. Everybody wears a mask, and you have to show your vaccination card every time you go into a public place. Like if you go to eat, you have to prove that you've been vaccinated. If you go to a movie or a concert or anything, that there are a
Things
bunch
in Berlin, yeah, it's in Berlin everywhere. It's like this. You have your passport, but they're very big in passports for always. We used to have passports if you got this. Yeah.
you have to have your vaccine card. And then when you went into a restaurant to eat, you use your phone and you would register with a little code square on the table. So that
Mhm.
kept track of who was there and who you were sitting next to in case there was an outbreak. They would be able to
Wow.
trace you.
Yeah.
So they were very good about that. Yeah.
But the most popular visiting area is actually, and I just listened to it, is Bavaria. Austria is very popular. From Germany, Bavaria is the #1
Yes.
spot to visit. Yeah.
Right. Yes, I asked somebody in Munich. We were in Munich just for one day, and I said, "Are you having a lot of tourists?" I asked a taxi driver, and he said they're mostly German tourists that are coming to Munich. No.
Yeah. Now they have for the second time canceled. First time in history, Oktoberfest was canceled last year, this year. First time in the whole history of that.
Yes. There were a lot of people there drinking beer, though.
Well, in München, you go and little boys of 8 or 9 sit next to their father and drink beer because I think it's food.
Yeah. No.
I think it's food because they have very strict laws with chemicals. It's basically just the hop, and so they just let them drink it. And mothers do it when they're breastfeed. They think the milk will be better.
It's the yeast. The yeast makes them more milk.
Yeah. Mhm.
Well, I haven't figured out how to get the music on yet. I was able to do this before, and I've forgotten how to broadcast, like get music from YouTube and then broadcast it through here.
Okay, well,
I'm still working on it. I've done it before. I don't know what my problem is.
it's not, each time is different.
Now, your system at Bloy House is different than systems I've used before.
Okay, oh, all right.
I mean, you're on Zoom, but everybody has it a little bit different.
Yeah, of course. Now we have our Beth Bianchi, who is from our group, but she is not on videos yet. Oh, there she is.
Hi.
Hi, Beth, yeah.
Good evening.
Hi there.
Hey, Sarah.
Hello, Mary. Hello.
Now, Beth, did I have this right? Were you the leader of the group from church and then you left the discussion? Is that right at the end to go?
Yes,
Okay.
yeah.
How did
we
that go? How did that go? Did you have a good discussion?
Well, you
Good.
know, we did, we've really grown as a group
Uh-huh.
during COVID. And Zoom has been a marvelous vehicle for us. So if I'm going to be honest here, which I will, we were more personal among ourselves. If we wanted to continue the content discussion, we would stay with you, but we just kind of carved this time out for
Sure,
ourselves.
of course.
So,
It's like going to church. Somebody said people don't feel that they've been to church unless they've said hello to at least 6 people.
Yeah,
you know what? That's exactly right. Yeah, that's exactly right. But we surely appreciate what you did last week. And boy, I love the referral to the music. That's a beautiful, beautiful.
yeah, yeah. Mhm.
I'm trying to remember the name of the CD now.
There's several. And the one about, I think it's called Ecstasy or Visions of Ecstasy or something like that is the most popular
the one you
popular
referred
album of medieval music ever.
it's beautiful. It's really
Yeah.
beautiful.
Mhm. That's another good thing that we can listen to so much music at just tapping in and listen to it.
Mhm.
Yeah, if you got the letter from me, the movie about Hildegard is pretty good too. It's in German, but it has subtitles.
Oh yeah.
I enjoyed
see
hearing
the-
it.
For what? Now that
You
we're
see the
together.
Terra X documentary in German, or which one did you see? The movie about her life?
Called Vision
Yeah.
in Aus den Leben Hildegard's von Bingen.
Aus dem Leben, yeah.
Yeah.
You must have understood some things because you're,
I get about 60%.
wow, that's good. That's good.
And
Well,
I
it's just-
intended to email you. I got the link that gave us the information about each one of the mystics that we're looking at, but I know there's something else that we didn't get.
No, it's
were-
all on this tiny URL. I call it Mystic Docs. And it's about, 15 pages of stuff that we'll refer to. You can look at
Right.
it on a computer or you can just print it. So you have it handy.
But was there something else? Was there another link that you sent to us? I thought you,
I don't think so. I don't have that letter with me, but
okay, you think we have it all?
I think so.
Okay.
Yeah.
Hey, Ken.
I can.
Hi, Peggy.
Hi.
Peggy.
Stacy. Queen Elizabeth is there as well. Stacy.
Yes, but tonight I'm at my desk instead of where I usually.
On your throne.
No, you sit on that. Yeah.
Hi, Ron.
Oh,
Oh, he's
connecting,
connecting.
actually.
He's connecting.
Ron's coming, yay.
Yeah.
He was there last time as well.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
And Peggy has her dinner. That's good.
Or I'm going to say that's ice cream.
Come to the end almost.
Yeah.
Where's Miss Lily? Huh,
Oh,
I usually have the cat on my lap.
Oh,
well, you must not have told her how interesting it is tonight, Peggy.
While we're waiting, it would be nice if everyone muted themselves unless they're speaking or have a comment to make, because otherwise we get lots of extraneous noises that sometimes can't be explained. But it cuts back on the.
Strange noises.
Hello, everybody, and I'm muting myself.
Okay, I'll go tell you a story about muting that happened this last week, because we had our diocesan convention online for the business meeting. Was sort of hybrid this year, and the first part was this past Saturday for the Diocese of Arizona, and they met online and did the business. So they had 400 or 500 people on Zoom. And it went pretty well because they had technicians and they were careful that they would mute everybody unless the chair recognized somebody, then they would unmute them to speak. But they had one little fail that was a little bit embarrassing, because one of the priests of the diocese was quacking on about something, blah, blah, blah. And one of the delegates who had spoken a little bit earlier, they had apparently forgotten to turn his microphone off. And so in the midst of this speech by one of the clergy, we hear this voice come across loud and clear, says, "Marge, would you please go get me 2 Tylenol?" Well, anyway, so I have to be very careful. Okay, we got somebody with a live mic now. I don't know. Would you all just check, make sure you're muted? Everybody muted? There's somebody that still have to look here. I think I can tell.
Peggy's not muted.
I can't tell if I'm muted or not.
You're not.
No, you'll have a little thing on your picture that has a microphone.
Yeah. Now I don't have. Wait a minute. Okay.
All right, is it everybody mute? Actually, there's probably a way I can mute you all, but I don't know what it is.
There is a way. If you look under participants, you should be able to mute us all.
Okay.
No, you're right. Mute all. All right. So do you need to raise your hand then if you, or can you just unmute yourself when you want to talk?
Most of us should be able to unmute ourselves.
Good. Okay. Because I want you to do more talking tonight. So get ready to do some more talking and sharing, because I got some questions for you after we talk a little bit about Catherine. Hello, everybody. Good to see you all again. And I think we got off to a good start last week, and I've been thinking a lot about Hildegard. She's probably the easiest one for me to talk about, and Catherine's a little tougher for me, and I'll tell you why in a minute when we get to that. But she is a very important figure, and she raises some very important questions for us, I think, today about sort of the role of spiritual discipline and what is really required for spiritual discipline. Is that sort of if we kind of forget about spiritual discipline, should we expect to experience God directly without some effort on our part? These are all questions I think we can maybe get into a little bit tonight after we just kind of have a little survey of some of her work. But before we do that, just to recap a little bit get your minds up to speed here about mysticism, about how mysticism has gotten kind of a bad press lately. It's in our post-Enlightenment age, it's considered by many to be sort of pathological or crazy or delusional. This is the area for spiritual fanatics, Jesus freaks, nutcases, whatever you want to call it. But the mystical tradition has always been part of the Christian tradition. And it becomes, I think, especially interesting during the Middle Ages. And it's especially interesting for me, and that's why I'm doing this class, when women become much more involved in the mystical tradition. And so we're kind of focusing on women and their particular contribution to this. Again, just to define what mysticism is, it is a search after a direct, unmediated experience of the divine. Okay, you don't need anything between you and God. You don't need the church, you don't need the Bible, you don't need anything. You just need to have a direct experience of God. Now, this is not in and of itself a uniquely Christian search. I mean, this is common to all religions, and it is certainly common for people who are not even religious, who will tell you that they have had a mystical experience that has shaken them deeply when they felt spiritually in tuned with the universe in some special way. But the Christian brand of this mystical goal, I think, traditionally focuses on three elements. One is purgation, one is contemplation, and the goal leading to unification. So those are vocabulary words that you're going to probably encounter in almost all of the almost any mystical writer that you come across, and certainly with our 4 women for this class. Mysticism is also apophatic. We talked about this before. This is a word to impress your friends at cocktail parties. Apophatic meaning the emphasis on what God is not rather than what God is. Because the mystics assume that any attempt on our part to describe God or characterize God or to understand God in rational terms is doomed to failure. The emphasis is on experiencing the love of God rather than understanding God. I've kind of summed up, some of you may know that famous quote from Carl Jung, the great psychologist who was a believer. And he was asked one time in an interview whether he believed in God. And his answer was, "I don't believe, I know." So the emphasis was on the experience of knowing God, not in an intellectual, heady sense, but experiencing the love of God rather than logically or rationally understanding God to give intellectual assent to. Well, why is it that women during the late medieval period begin to play a larger role in this Christian mystical tradition? There's no, I think, one simple answer, but we touched on a few of these, and we're going to come back to some of those. One, there were economic factors during this time that allowed women to take a larger economic role in society. There was a tendency towards urbanization, which has a different kind of an ethic or a culture than, say, rural life does. I mean, that's true today. I mean, people tend to be more, quote, progressive or liberated or whatever you want to call it, that live in cities compared to those people that live on farms, for example. There's a great malaise during the 14th and 15th century in the church that's caused by a number of different things. One is this growing corruption of the church that maybe reaches its high point during the 70 years or so when the Pope is not in Rome, but in Avignon as a sort of puppet of the French king. And this causes all kinds of resentment and bad press, really, for the church. When we get to Catherine's time, the church is also experiencing, after the Avignon period, the church is also experiencing this time known as the Great Schism of the church, when there are conflicting popes. At one point, there were 3 different men all claiming to be pope and all vying for support from the various political powers of the time. And again, this is regarded with a great deal of horror and shock by folks in the pew, we might say. Like, what, there's one pope, how can there be 3 popes? And how could the pope be living in France rather than living in Rome? And especially during the time that the popes were in Rome, for a lot of political factors, they spent most of their time raising money. That's about the only thing they were interested in, getting more and more money into their treasury, because they became more and more absorbed in the power politics of the day, and they needed money to mount armies and do those kind of things. So they become more and more venial and materialistic, and all of this is very much resented by common folks who say, that's not what the church is supposed to be doing. Now, despite all of that corruption, that doesn't mean people are any less religious or spiritual. In fact, they tend to be even more so. This is a time where more and more people go on pilgrimage. They give money to build chantry chapels to pray for the repose of their relative souls. They're very interested in saints. That's what they go on pilgrimages, to go and visit the graves of saints. So there's a growing cult of saints. There are lay movements that are beginning. One of them I mentioned before, which I'm particularly interested in, are the Beguines and the Begharts, who are people who commit themselves to living a religious life, but not in a monastery or a convent, but in their ordinary household. And sometimes they create households of like-minded people, kind of, we call them maybe communes, as it were, that would live a religious life, live a simple life, do charitable things, care for the sick, copy manuscripts, things like that. But they weren't religious. They weren't under orders. They didn't have a rule of life, or weren't part of a monastic group. The Begharts were one that you might have heard of. The Brethren of the Common Life was another group. There was a desire for vernacular literature so that people could live out their life of faith, live their spiritual lives in a language that they could understand. And in fact, all four of our women made major contributions to the language of the area they were living in. We're going to do Julian of Norwich next week. She is the first book written in English was written by Julian of Norwich. So all of these women, in the case of Catherine, she influenced the development of the Italian language. Hildegard with German to an extent, although Hildegard was interested in her own language. Remember, we talked about that, and she invented her own language, which was pretty cool. And then Teresa of Avila also had a huge influence on Spanish, the development of Spanish. So they were all interested in vernacular literature. And in the universities, the many hundred-year quest to logically understand the faith by combining or synthesizing philosophy, particularly Aristotelian philosophy, and the Bible and faith into one system in which you could look at your Christian faith in a rational, clear, systematized way. And perhaps the greatest advocate of this was Thomas Aquinas. The scholastic system itself begins to become under attack and is rejected in many cases by a growing group in the university system known as the nominalists, who rejected scholasticism as it had been upheld by the church for a long time. So there's this kind of great malaise in the later Middle Ages in the church. There's a distrust of the church, there's corruption in the church. The intellectual underpinnings of the medieval church are beginning to fall apart. And there are more and more people that are sort of asking themselves, quite frankly, well, who needs them? Who needs the church? We can do this on our own. We don't need to have this corrupt church standing between us and God. We don't even need the sacramental system standing between us and God. We can do this on our own. We can live a Christian life, one that models ourselves after the apostles, let's say. We can talk about scripture in our own language. This is a time where there's increasing pressure for translations of the Bible into vernacular languages. We don't need the church anymore. We don't need any intermediaries in order to experience God in our lives. And the women mystics are doing, and there are a lot of them. We're just picking, 4, but there are hundreds of people living this or attempting to live the religious life and are writing about it and describing their experiences, and they're describing especially their emotional, their visionary experiences of God in their own life. Now, women are doing some particularly interesting things that I just want to have you underline again. One of the things they begin to do, which gains them greater credibility in late medieval society, is they begin to take on heroic asceticism. We're going to talk about that in a minute. Asceticism's always been part of Christian life. In other words, you need to live. Let's take Anthony of Egypt in the 4th century. That you need to divest yourself of clothing, of good food, all this. You have to live this austere life in order to prepare yourself to be able to experience God in your life. I'm going to come back to that in a minute. But one of the things that women are doing is they are beginning to kind of match their male counterparts in ascetic practices. In other words, we can do this just as well as we're not weak creatures. We can fast and subject ourselves to mortification of the flesh just as you guys can. And in fact, we can do it better in some cases. So they're beginning to assume expressions of heroic asceticism. They are forming partnerships with like-minded men, partnerships not in the sense of sexual partnerships, but spiritual partnerships, spiritual friendships with religious men, and working on things together. We find that in the case of almost all of these women. We talk about Hildegard. She had Volmar, who wrote down everything for her. In the case of Catherine, she had her own sort of devoted disciple who wrote down a lot of stuff, but who also then was kind of a channel to get men into Catherine's spiritual circle as well. And they develop these women mystics develop a unique spirituality, which is important to us today. It's a spirituality which is more body-centered, emotive. It uses symbols from weddings, nuptial symbols, erotic symbols, and courtly love symbols. In the medieval times, there's this whole culture of what's called courtly love, about how you're supposed to behave towards your beloved, and there's a whole poetic tradition. That's too much for us to get into here, but it's this courtly love tradition about talking about God, in particular talking about Jesus in terms of your lover, in courtly love language. Just to give you one little example, so I didn't know this until the other day, but some of you are familiar with the feast of Corpus Christi, the body of Christ, which is like the 6th of June or something like that. And if you've ever seen that, I don't know if you've ever seen that practiced here in the United States, but in Europe, I can remember when I lived in Europe, on the Feast of Corpus Christi, they would put the host in a monstrance, big thing, and they'd go out and they'd parade around town with the body of Christ for everybody to venerate. Well, the Feast of Corpus Christi is a relatively new feast in the church, and it was invented in the late medieval times by a woman. Okay, so you see there's this devotion to the sort of the bodily or emotive aspects of spirituality. Last week talked about Hildegard. She was the first one we talked about, but in a way she is a prelude really for some of the great women visionaries of the late Middle Ages. And kind of a trendsetter. That's why I've called all of these women of vision, women of power, because she embodies a number of themes that we see in all of them. First of all, she was highly effective, wasn't she? Hildegard, she was a polymath, a brilliant woman who accomplished all kinds of stuff in all sorts of fields and was a political figure to be reckoned with. You know, she dealt with popes and archbishops, and one of the things that she does that's totally unheard of her time, she goes on a preaching tour. That would have been just unthinkable for a woman to be out publicly preaching, you know, because there's all that stuff in the New Testament, right, about women are supposed to be silent in church. So she's this incredibly strong figure, but she's highly effective. And we're going to see this in all four of our women, that they are not only visionary women, but they are powerful women, and that they base their authority on vision. Okay. And I was sort of joking before when I said, it's a little hard to argue with somebody when they say to you, well, God told me this. All right. Now, what makes their saying, God told me this, particularly effective to medieval people is it goes hand in hand with this heightened ascetical heroism on their part. Now let's talk a little bit more about asceticism, because you may know it comes from ekesis, which means training. Like it means training for an athletic event. And we've seen asceticism in the church from the very beginning. There's sort of this assumption that one needs to purify oneself before you're even able to perceive the divine in your life, because these other things are so distracting that it doesn't allow us to really pay attention to what's going on in a spiritual plane. Now, of course, people have been doing this for a long time. But these women are beginning to claim that they can practice mortification of the flesh just as good as their brothers, even better. And they do this in ways that would seem to us to be, I think most of us would seem to be almost pathological, if not pathological. So for instance, there's a big question with Catherine, I'm going to talk about in a minute. Is Catherine an anorexic? Yes. Okay. So what do we need to make of that? But she's not the most extreme. She doesn't eat, she eats practically nothing. And the last 3 or 4 months of her life, she existed only on the Eucharistic bread. That's the only thing she ate. One contemporary woman mystic of this time, Mary of Oine, cut off parts of herself. Now, you know, where does this relate? I'm not a psychologist, but where does this relate to cutting oneself? She actually cut pieces of her flesh off of her body as a way of mortification of the flesh. And yet her biographer is not shocked by this, but instead says, because, and this is a man now speaking, because of her doing that, he says, power came out of her. At these moments, that power came out of her. Now, in the early church, how was it that what was the one card that women could play in terms of power? Anybody know what if you were Lucy or Agnes or one of those 4th or 5th century saints? What is it that you could do that nobody could really stop you from doing, that was a way of claiming your own power?
Would it be being a mother?
Going before that.
Like having a period?
No.
Isn't it being a virgin?
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Saying that you're going to live a chaste life, refusing to get married, because the expectation is you're going to get married. There's no question about it. And your family's going to arrange that. So if you look at these hagiographies of people like St. Lucy or St. Agnes or some of those, you know, relatively early women saints, what is the thing they do? No, Father, I'm not going to marry the guy that you've set me up to get married. I'm going to live a chaste life. And then they try to sometimes kill them for that decision. But that's in a sense, that's the one card that they have to play. You get to the women in the Middle Ages, they've got another card now they're playing. Well, actually 2 more cards they're playing. They're playing the card of asceticism. I'm just as holy in my practice of my religion and my mortification of the flesh. I'm just as good as you guys are. And in fact, I'm better in some cases. And not only that, but because of that, those you better take the visions that I'm saying seriously. This is not just some, housefrau that's saying this. This is a woman who has demonstrated her holiness by the fact that because of the mortification of flesh. So that's why they pay attention. Why do they pay attention to Catherine, for example? Because she is a model of those 2 things. She says, God speaks to me, and you know what? I don't eat anything. I mean, I'm being a little flippant here, but you get the point. So people say, whoa, this has got to be a holy woman. We got to pay attention to what she's saying. All right. So it's a way of exercising that spiritual power. Okay. Catherine, I forgot to say, by the way, that Catherine also is living through the Black Death, which is, I did a whole course on the Black Death, and maybe I'll do another course on the Black Death. But, the Black Death heightens all of these other trends that we talked about in late medieval society, because it's another example of the church failing. The Black Death, the church failed. You've got half the population dying from the bubonic plague, and the church either is incapable of doing anything to avert it or chooses not to do anything to avert it except say pray harder. So the church has lost that public relations battle, which just adds fuel to the fire of people saying, who needs the church? We can experience God on our own. We don't need all that stuff. There's a bunch of crooks anyway. Okay. So let's talk about Catherine. Catherine de Giacomo de Benincasa. She was born in 1347, and she was number 22 of 25 children. And her mother outlived her. Her mother's name was Lapa. She has her first vision when she is age 6, when she's walking outside Siena, which is the beautiful city that she comes from. Her father is a merchant in Siena. She sees Christ in the sky, dressed, oddly enough, in white papal robes, and he blesses her from the sky. And, for the most part, she's just like most young women, young girls. But she plays that first card when her sister Bonaventura dies, and her father wants her to marry the widower. In other words, her sister's husband who survives. He's okay. Well, no, your sister died. Now you're going to marry him, and she refuses to do that. She fasts. She cuts her hair off. She does everything that she can to make herself look unattractive, and she sort of retreats into her bedroom under the stairs, not unlike Harry Potter, living under the stairs, and refuses to come out or to eat anything until her father finally gives in and says, all right, I've had it, do whatever you want. I'm sick of fighting with you and arguing with you. She says in one of her writings, she says, build a cell inside your mind from which you can never flee. Retreat into this solitude, this isolation. She wants to become a Dominican tertiary. In other words, she's not joining the Dominican order, she's becoming a third order Dominican. And there's a group of these tertiaries in Siena called Montaletta, and they're all widows. And she wants to join them, and they don't want to let her join their group because they say, you're not a widow. But finally, her mother talks the Montaletta into letting her join, even though she's just a young teenage girl. But she learns how to read and write from them, even though she was never very comfortable in Latin. And for a long time, she lived at her home in solitude and in silence. We got some pictures of her here. her that's Siena. Her house is still there. You can go to Siena and visit it. And she lived, like I say, she lives for quite a while in her family house with her myriad brothers and sisters, until she has a visionary experience around 21 years old. When she's 21 years old, gotta find. And this particular event, this is another reason why it's a little hard to talk about Catherine, because some of this stuff seems pretty bizarre to us. She has what she describes as a mystical marriage with Christ, in which Christ betroths her as his bride by giving her a ring made from his foreskin. Now, this would sound really, really weird, but let's unpack a little bit of the religious symbolism about this. So the blood of Christ is for Catherine, and I think for us, the saving element that Christ does. Christ sheds his blood for us and thus saves us, right? I mean, that's pretty common language. So what's the first time that Christ sheds his blood for us? When he's circumcised as a little boy. Right? So this idea of blood is really important to Catherine. And I would venture to say that it might also have something to do with menstruation, which she's probably not because she's anorexic. But she writes to, later on in life, she writes to to one of her followers, and she says, "Bathe in the blood of Christ crucified. See that you don't look for or want anything but the crucified, as a true bride ransomed by the blood of Christ, crucified, for that is my wish. You see very well that you are a bride and that he has espoused you, you and everyone else, not with a ring of silver, but with a ring of his own flesh. Look at the tender little child who on the 8th day, when he was circumcised, gave up just so much flesh as to make a tiny circlet of a ring." Now, again, this language is a little bit bizarre to us, but it makes, I think, some sense given the world that she lives in. This emphasis on the saving blood of Christ and this emphasis on the marriage or the espousal to Jesus. Why is this important for women? Because, folks, men can't marry Jesus and women can, right? Let's think about that for a while. Men can't marry Jesus, but women can. So this idea of this heavenly wedding with Jesus becomes really important to her. She gets checked out by the Dominican chapter in 1374. She forms a friendship with a man who's going to be her kind of confessor and who writes down much of what she does, Raymond of Capua. He's kind of like Volmar was for Hildegard. And because of this spiritual marriage, part of this vision is because Christ's blood is shed for her in this way, that she is not called to hide under the staircase and live a life of fasting and silence, but instead is called to a life of activity within the world. And it all goes to this experience of the heavenly wedding that she has with Jesus. So she gets involved with local politics, and she gets an increasing reputation of being this holy woman. So people pay attention to what she says, and she becomes a mediating force. She goes around and visits various Italian city-states and helps them, keeps them out of trouble with the Papal League. And during this time, she claims to have stigmata, like St. Francis did, the wounds of Christ. However, in her case, she asked God to make them invisible. She knows they're there, but people can't see them because she doesn't want to attract attention to herself. She, in addition to traveling around and taking this political role, she dictates many letters, some of which are still existent, including writing to Pope Gregory XI, who is one of these popes at Avignon. And she urges him in no uncertain terms that to get back to Rome. Now you got to think about this. Here's this little uneducated, anorexic, sort of religious woman who writes to Pope Gregory, and she doesn't call him in the letter. She doesn't call him Holy Father. She calls him Babbo, which means like pops. And here's what she says. My dear father, another Babbo, I'm begging you, I'm telling you to come. In the name of Christ, I am telling you, don't choose to listen to the devil's advisors. They would like to block your holy and good resolution. Be a courageous man for me, not a coward. In other words, she's saying, man up, man up. Respond to God. Here's the second page of this. I have another page of this, which I can't find. She says, respond to God. And if you don't, I'm going to be, don't make me tell the Son of God about you. Oh, she says, don't make it necessary for me to complain about you to Christ crucified. Man up and become the vicar of become the glorious shepherd, St. Peter, whose vicar you are. Can you imagine anybody writing to the Pope like that today and calling him, hey, Pops, I got a word from God about you, and that is get your butt back to Rome, or I'm going to have to complain to Christ myself about you. This is pretty powerful stuff, isn't it? So she finds time with her political life to also do her religious thing, her writing. She founds a monastery nearby Siena, and she spends a lot of time in retreat there, writing about her visions. It's called the Dialogue, which you can read. It's an important linguistic influence. It's written in Tuscan Italian. In one of her peace missions, she almost gets herself killed in Florence, but is rescued in the nick of time. She ends up her life going to Rome to support Urban VI in person and in letters, and she dies in Rome at age 33 after not eating anything except the Eucharist for several months. So, what do you make of this strange young woman? Oh, by the way, she had an interesting, I got a picture of her here. There she is in a medieval painting, getting the ring made from the foreskin of Christ. And there's an interesting story. At the end of her life, she died in Rome, but the people in Siena wanted her body, and so there was a little plot, and they chopped off her head and brought her head back to Siena. And I even had a picture of it, but it's not coming up. Well, we'll look for that next time. Picture of her head. Let's see here. If I could. Let's say technical difficulties of getting out of my sharing with you. How do I do that? I'm going to escape. I'm going to what I thought was stop share. Oh, there's her head. Now, anybody know how I get out of the share? It says stop share, but I'm pushing it and not getting anything. Pause share. I'm getting everybody else. Now I've got Julia Norwich.
Nope. Now you've stopped sharing.
Oh, good.
Yeah, you're fine. You're all back. It's normal.
Again, good. All right. So, what do you think? What would you make of somebody like this? Say you're working in a church. Those of you who are thinking about being clergy, or you're in some church kind of thing, church setting, and some 21-year-old comes to you who doesn't eat, finds food repulsive, tells you that she has visions, tells you that she is the bride of Christ. What would you make of this?
One thing I find interesting about her and a lot of the other mystics too about with this, the starvation, is that she actually did a lot of good and she was active in, you know, taking care of people and healing people and feeding people. She cut short her life and doing more good by not eating. And I think that's very sad that the social services part of her life was cut short.
Yeah, she did do that for sure. Can you think of anybody? Do we have any modern equivalents of people who, based on their, in a sense, their asceticism, or gain authority from their asceticism?
Mother Teresa,
Okay.
and she ate very little and she slept on the floor.
Andy.
You know,
I was thinking, some of you a little older, I was thinking Cesar Chavez
oh,
might have been an example of that.
Dalai Lama, maybe?
Mhm. Okay. What do you make of the larger question of asceticism or purification, or the role of suffering? Do you think that it's true, in order to have this relationship with God, this union with God, we have to somehow find a way of rejecting those things in life that pull us away from that? And if so, what's a healthy way of doing that, and what's an unhealthy way? Let me give just a few examples, and then you'll see what you have to say. But it wasn't until a few years ago that I really gave any attention at all to fasting. And yet fasting has been part of the Christian tradition since year one. And there are people like Richard Foster. If you ever read Richard Foster's book, Celebration of Discipline, talks about, the important role that fasting really plays in one's prayer life. But my guess is you don't hear too much about fasting in church, do you? I don't know. Maybe you do. Maybe you go to a church where they talk about fasting. That would be one example, maybe of physical disciplines that lead to a heightened spiritual state. What are some of the experiences the rest of you had with that?
In Judaism, there's 5 different days of mandatory fasting. Yom Kippur is a 26-hour fast of no food or drink. And the Feast of Ganesh, the 9th of Av, come to mind as something that's quite regular and quite accepted in Jewish circles.
Mm-hmm.
And there's Ramadan.
And the Islam has it as well. Ramadan, you have the same.
Yeah. It's pretty tough too, from what I understand from my Muslim brothers and sisters. It's quite
And there's this concept in Buddhism of the asceticism has a big landscape in Buddhism, but this word renunciation, which is really a word that one would lean into, because for me anyway, and that's the word that I came to when you were speaking and asking the questions. Of sort of self-imposed suffering seems a bit abrupt and self-destructive, but renunciation has a different, rounder edges to it, maybe, I don't know, but I think there's really something to it. And I think that our tradition has different forms of it, of silence and fasting and sort of giving things up.
Do you think Episcopalians have any room in our spiritual lives for, I guess, for lack of a better word, spiritual disciplines? And what's a healthy spiritual discipline? What's an unhealthy spiritual discipline?
Well, in my time in the monastery and that, I had a great aunt who was an Episcopal nun, and they were considered, by the way, brides of Christ, and they all wore a wedding ring. Is they had the great silence, and you weren't allowed to speak for 12 or 14 hours in the evening or anything like that. After Compline, there was no talking at all until after matins.
Right. That silence is especially difficult for Episcopalians. Especially Episcopal clergy, I would add.
Find that breath control, breathing exercises and breath control helps. And I've also discovered that the daily practices of the offices and really connecting into the prayers is a discipline, very good discipline.
I have a daily meditation practice, a half an hour of complete silence and sort of dropping into a deep sense of stillness. And I do it every morning.
Do you think that's the same though as asceticism?
No, but it is a discipline.
which all of our folks would say was important, contemplation.
Well, in Catherine's case, her first vision, she was just a child. She was probably not starving herself at that point.
No.
So she didn't need asceticism for her first vision, seems.
I don't really practice anything super ascetic right now, but I think like back when I was like 20 and actually going to more of an evangelical church, I was more interested in and did more fasting back then. And I've done like a silent retreats here and there. I'd like to do more. I think there is something really beautiful in those kind of practices when you can get outside of your regular routine and just turn those things off. But I do think, I guess like one big difference, if I get for probably for clergy or leaders or people in church today compared to like at Catherine's age is that, I mean, there's also like a moral and like legal framework now where, if you notice one of your youth is anorexic and they're saying it's for the Lord, we don't live like there's certain like societal responsibilities I think now in how you would counsel that maybe didn't exist back in Catherine's time.
Okay, so maybe I could expand this question a little bit and say, it's pretty clear that people consider Catherine to be a holy woman and therefore pay attention to what she says, even to the point of saying, lay down your guns, and not guns, but your crossbows and so on. Lay down your weapons and make peace with each other. Who do we consider holy people, and on what basis? Her basis was that people recognized that she had visions from God, and people recognized that she practiced asceticism, and therefore she was a holy woman. This is a holy woman that we need to listen to because she's telling us what God wants us to do. What are the criteria for us today for that sort of authority to speak the holy? Or isn't there any?
I don't know, the first like kind of example that jumps to my head actually isn't even like a religious one, but for like I keep thinking of Greta Thunberg as someone that people seem to want to listen to even as a young person. But I know when she was doing her like climate talks, her like choosing to not fly and give up that privilege and instead was able to sail, I think, in order to do her tours. I think it's, in my mind, I mean, it's kind of vague, but I would say like a boldness and an appearance of practicing what you preach.
Okay. Can you go a little bit more with that, Amanda? I think you're onto something there.
I think it's a sense of, I guess just like a sense of like authenticity.
Okay. Okay.
And speaking to something like bigger than yourself, I guess.
Okay. I like your word authenticity because, you know, in my dealings with younger people as a bishop, this was a word that used to come up a lot, was authenticity. That young people were looking for authenticity. They were looking for people who practice what they preach. And what they found pretty much at church was not that, right? Was not authenticity. So who would be, what would make somebody the kind of person that would be an authentic person that others would listen to? What are the qualities of that person that would?
That I get really nervous about, because I think that there's some degree in like today in like having such like a heterogeneous like society that it becomes a little bit subjective. Like I think there's people that, you know, for example, think of Kanye West's display of religiosity as something authentic and a worthy religious voice to listen to. I don't agree with that myself. So I'm not sure personally.
So this past week, I went on a virtual pilgrimage, and I was noticing that when they're talking about saints, a lot of times you hear in the story about they came from a wealthy family and then choose to become poor, and they live this, you know, poor life. And it made me realize that there was in these stories a privilege about being wealthy. And then what about the saints who were born poor and continue to live their poor life? We don't put much stock in their lives as much. And it made me wonder how I'm going to start looking at saint stories. If I take away their wealth and their privilege, am I still attracted to this story? And I'm kind of hearing this a little bit of here about like Greta, you know, that she decided that she was going to give up things because she had the privilege to actually travel in planes. But think of all the people who don't have privilege to travel in planes and still want to save the environment, you know. So, but she becomes elevated because she gives it up.
Yeah, I think going back to what Amanda was saying, I think still for us, the idea of it's kind of a cliche, but practicing what you preach. And I think you can think of examples of that. For instance, one always comes to mind for me is Pope Francis compared to his predecessor, let's say. You know, in his style of life, choosing not to live in a palace, choosing to go in a Fiat instead of a limo, to wear brown shoes instead of red satin. You know, I mean, it's this sort of practicing what you preach that makes people pay attention, maybe where they wouldn't as much. It gives you that authenticity. And in which case, where, especially for Episcopalians, do we get that? You know, here we are, the wealthiest denomination in the country, Christian group in the country. Is there anything we're doing that people see us as being in any way authentic, or just a bunch of rich folks playing church?
I went to a diocesan convention about 25, 30 years ago, and the woman was a speaker, and she announced that she did not take the suite that they had purchased for her at the expensive hotel near the airport, choosing to drive instead to the convention each day because she said it wasn't that far. And that made an impression on me because I was thinking of all the people that were staying in that fancy hotel, and here this keynote speaker was driving every day to the convention because she thought that was a waste of money.
Good example. Yeah, I mean, the word holy, you all know this. The word holy means being separate, being different. And I think when you look at the early church grows because people are different than everybody else. They, their way of living is different than the society in which they live in, and people can identify and often get in trouble. That they get in trouble for that, but there are a whole list of things that they do differently. Some of which we would agree with, and some we wouldn't agree with. But they don't live like everybody else does. And the fact of the matter is that most modern Christians are pretty indistinguishable from the background noise of the secular society that they live in. Or as the old joke is, if you were arrested for being a Christian, would there be enough evidence to convict you? Is there anything that we do that's different in the way that we live our lives that is in fact countercultural with the society that we live in? Or are we just as caught up in consumerism and materialism, and then the bad things too, the sexism, the racism, all that kind of stuff, as everybody else is? So this question of where we gain our integrity, or where we gain our authority to speak on spiritual topics, is really a vital question for us, isn't it? And I'm not sure we've come up with a good answer yet. I mean, we're still living in that Constantinian church where probably none of you are going to have to do this, but when we're called upon to bless the hounds or the new aircraft carrier. So I'm hoping that somebody like Catherine, I think all of us, if a Catherine came into our studies, if we were a clergy person, we would think that she was nuts. We probably think John the Baptist was nuts too, but and a lot of these people that we think were nuts. But I mean, we would think she was anorexic. She needs to see a psychiatrist, and she's probably these visions are delusional, and she's got some sort of weird sexual thing going on too. That we would dismiss her. Her society listened to her. So my question is, what do we do so that our folks around us listen to what gives us that spiritual authority to speak of God and be taken seriously?
I think it's a great question, Bishop Kirk. If one presupposes that half the population likes change and half the population of the world doesn't like change, and I consider myself part of the former, I like the new and different. And it also speaks to the degree of change and the necessity for change at the times that you shared earlier, historically. To answer your question more specifically, the degree of commitment to self-sacrifice, maybe not just, but consistent self-sacrifice, at least captures attention and say, okay, that would gain interest and probably curiosity if someone is consistently self-sacrificing toward the good. I was a Peace Corps volunteer in the 80s, countercultural during the Reagan era. Sorry to upset anyone's sensibilities. But I was countercultural, and I was privileged, according to a lady here, to say that I was even able to join the Peace Corps. But it's amazing how happy you can be living on $200 stipend a month. I remember walking down the path in the middle of a jungle saying, I'm super happy. And it wasn't sort of a noble savage thing, but it was real. So that wasn't a spiritual endeavor, certainly. However, having had that experience, it's amazing how what happens when you're not in the kitchen eating all the time. You do have the capacity to do other things, which may involve spiritual reflection or ecstasy if you're not eating. So those are some random thoughts I have.
Good. Well, as you can see, I've opened far more cans of worms than I've solved for you, but I'm hoping that our mystics will do that a little bit for us and raise these difficult questions, because we've got to find an answer for our own time, just like she had to find an answer for her time. So next time we're going to talk about Julian of Norwich and kind of focus on the question, is there such a thing as a feminine spirituality or not? That's kind of the thing I'd like to, and you know, I'm highly presumptuous for me to be answering that question. So I really need you to help me with that. And if there is, where does that need to inform theology like we do it today, you know, as we're doing it today? Is it just being politically correct, or is it deeper than that? All right. So we'll look at what Julian has to say. Julian's probably the easiest for us as Episcopalians, by the way. I don't, you know, I see a lot about Julian. I don't see much about Catherine of Siena. I see a lot about Julian. She's a little more of a accessible figure to us, I think, than Catherine. Okay, so anybody wants to stick around? I'll stick around for a little while, but I think we reached our hour time, and
yeah, and we are going to have our after discussion now.
We have your après class discussion.
Yeah, après class. Yeah. Thank you so much.
I'll stand by for a minute. But going to stick around. The rest of you, see you next week.
Yes.
I have one question.
Well, while you're,
let's wait till everybody gets out, and then stay on mute unless you're talking. Okay, asking questions. Somebody said they had a question.
I do. When I was reading about Catherine, I read that she had beaten herself with chains, and she said that suffering is a way to restore peace to humankind.
Yeah, on your reading list, and we never got to some of her great quotes, which are great, by the way. You know, everything else aside, most of these quotes are suitable for framing and inspiration for us today. But her biographer here, who I put on, Don Brophy, who wrote this book, Catherine of Siena, Passionate Life. I have a quote from him just about that, and it's on your Mystic Doc sheets, but let's just read it for a second, because I think he addresses this exactly right. Males who had the social task of teaching and governing were identified in the popular mind as the divinity of Christ, whereas females who menstruated, bore children, and produced milk more closely represented his humanity. They identified with the Godhead through their bodies. To us, many centuries later, it's essential to keep the social context in mind. Catherine beat her body with a metal chain, deprived herself of sleep and food, and shunned normal human contact, all of which may seem bizarre, self-indulgent, and possibly unbalanced. I would say certainly unbalanced today. Medieval people, and Catherine in particular, did not see it that way. They believed that voluntary suffering had a wider context. Suffering was a way to restore peace to humankind. If sin can invade the body of society, then so can virtue. Since the time of Francis of Assisi in the 13th century, the notion of freely accepted suffering, in the words of one commentator, bore the mark of exquisite social concern. Such suffering was no longer the price of human sinfulness. Suffering embraced was the provenance of love. This gets in that whole, you know, this whole mysterious, the hardest thing I think about our faith is to understand the role of suffering. And she's understanding it a little bit differently, that suffering is a redemptive act. It's a way of redeeming the universe. So it's not something to be avoided at all costs, but it's to be entered into, which of course is a kind of Christ-like thing, isn't it? I mean, that's a New Testament idea, I think.
But isn't there enough suffering with your fasting and sleep deprivation without beating yourself with a chain? I don't understand the beating yourself with a chain, how that does anything but possibly cause infection and all kinds of nasty things.
Yeah, it seems weird to us, doesn't it? It really does. It's very strange.
not really. Doesn't the psalm say, beat me with hyssop and I shall be pure? I seem to remember that from one of the Psalms.
Yeah, but I think the idea of taking on suffering is one that it's so, when Jesus says, take up your cross and follow me, we all interpret that in stoic terms. You know what I mean by stoicism? Like, oh, I got this bad stuff in life. I got to put up with it. And I just have to, my uncle used to say, my aunt used to say of my uncle, he's the cross I have to bear. It's sort of like, oh, this is a crappy situation, but you just grin and bear it. And that's stoicism. Folks, that's not really Christianity. And if we really, I think, got this thing that when Jesus is talking about taking up your cross, he's not just putting up with shit. He's talking about entering into suffering. It's picking up that weight and carrying it yourself, which means that Christians are called, like Jesus does, is to enter into places of suffering voluntarily, right? Not just because it's the political right thing to do, but or the humane thing to do, but it's because that if Jesus is there, that's where we have to be as Jesus's followers. And that means that we have to, as somebody says, Christians go looking for trouble. We go looking for trouble. We're looking for those places where there is pain and suffering in the world in which to enter into and to help carry as Jesus does. And that's a redemptive act. Maybe that's getting too far away from Catherine, but I think that
as myself as a Franciscan tertiary, one of the hardest things, entering into Franciscanism, thinking it's all about, deer and woodland creatures, and then to come across the story of true joy. And it's all about suffering. And so, you have to think about that, of seeking true joy in suffering. It's a hard concept to get into your head.
It's the hardest. Yeah, because nobody wants suffering. I mean, I don't think I don't want any more suffering. Thank you very much. I mean, I have to have a big meltdown, like if I get a headache or something, I don't want any suffering. I'm not going to go and enter into people's pain. I don't want to do that. I got enough pain of my own, but that's not what we're told to do. That's why I say that thing about taking up your cross and carrying it is the scariest passage in the entire New Testament. And if we understood it, we'd all run screaming out of church.
But isn't our own suffering, if we come up against a disease or a disease with our partner or a loved one, and we offer it up to God, isn't that suffering? Isn't that our own? I mean, that comes as personal as it can be. If we don't run away from it, but we're stoic in it, isn't that our own suffering? Isn't that our own experience? Isn't that our own, isn't that the same thing? I mean, we don't have to run and, fast and become anorexic. We have suffering in our own lives. And if we offer it up to Christ, then we experience the same thing, don't we?
Well, yeah, but I think it goes beyond just what we are experiencing. I mean, Richard Rohr, one place he talks about how it's so easy to get depressed by all of the pain that we see in the world, but that's exactly what we have to do. We have to be in that pain. We cannot run away from it. And we try to, we either ignore it or anesthetize ourselves to it. But that's part of our job, is to enter into that pain when we see it. And I think, most people can do that a little bit. When we see somebody who's hurting, most people try to respond, and they are compassionate, which means to suffer along with. And, we try to do that, but on a really big scale, it becomes quite terrifying.
Is it part of the suffering issue is that you're to suffer with Christ on the cross? And that to participate in his suffering too?
Yes, and I think so. And I used to have a parishioner who always talked that way, and I could never figure out what she meant. But she suffered a lot of physical pain, and she said when she was in pain, she would offer that pain up to Christ, not saying, "Oh, take this away from me," but that this was somehow an offering, a good thing. And I still try to wrap my head around that. But she's a lot holier than I was.
To be Franciscan, that true joy, the suffering is coming from the outside to you, and that you experience joy in it as you participate in that suffering with Christ. It's hard.
But see, we don't really talk about that in church very much, do we?
We do with the Franciscans.
Okay, well, different Franciscans. I mean, I think that you find, the typical sort of pan-Protestant American experience is that a religion is somehow connected with self-help and getting better. If we go to church, we're going to be better people and happier people and more successful people. And that's not really, I think, what Jesus is talking about. He's not talking about being good. He's talking about being godly. And sometimes they're two different things. But the whole prosperity gospel, come to church and then you're going to make a lot of money and you're going to be happy and your kids are going to love you and you're going to be kind to your spouse and all that kind of stuff.
The idea that if God loves you, you're going to have it all.
You're going to be richly blessed, right?
Exactly. # blessed.
Yeah, which is, I've always find, Amanda, one of the most problematic things, and I say it, and I hear people say it all the time. I am so blessed that blah, blah, blah. I'm so blessed that I have this beautiful house, or I have this wonderful job, or I have these great kids, whatever it is. I'm so blessed. And yet, what does that say about the people that don't have that?
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's a really difficult idea. I just opened up all kinds of hard things for you tonight. I'm not giving you any easy answers today.
I'm doing some free classes with a seminary that my friend goes to. And this past week, our reading was about essentially the early beginning of monasticism. So this is all very fresh in my head, and talking and writing about asceticism and everything. It's intense, but it's very good. I mean, I think that, like I said in a posting that I had to do based on the readings, that even if it's just for a weekend or something, I think that the attempting to practice some of that those monastic or ascetic things, there's my dog, not necessarily beating yourself with chains, because I mean I can understand suffering as a way of turning the other cheek and that sort of thing. But when you're physically inflicting it on yourself in that way, that's a bit hard for me to wrap around. Willie, it's okay. But I mean, I think there's definitely value in seeking out at some level of aesthetic experience, and seeing how being open to how God might ask you to live a more simple or a more aesthetic life in some degree.
Mm-hmm.
I would like to see more asceticism within the church myself.
Okay. Well, I'm sorry I raised so many difficult questions tonight, but and I don't have easy answers to any of them, but I think it's important that we think about them, particularly how it relates to the church. And I wonder sometimes whether we as Episcopalians generally really understand this whole concept of suffering. And I'll tell you one little story and then I'll shut up and it's time to go. But as you were talking, Amanda, I was thinking about this Good Friday service that I went to when I was at our church. It's St. James, Wilshire Boulevard, where I used to be rector many years ago. And I was always surprised at Good Friday because I'd look out there and none of the people that should have been there, I thought, were there. The vestry never came to Good Friday. And the so-called pillars of the church were never there on Good Friday. And I looked out and there were all these people that I had never seen before, and including this little group of ancient African-American women who I would only see on Good Friday. And I said to my assistant, I wonder what it is. Why are these old African-American ladies here? And my assistant said to me, maybe it's only old African-American ladies that understand what Good Friday is all about. And I think that's probably right. You know, that are prosperous, well-fed people that have never suffered for no reason of their own, except in this case, the color of their skin or their economic position. Don't get that somehow. They did. They knew what Jesus on the cross was all about. And I'm not sure we do sometimes. So we have to maybe work harder to understand it. Okay.
Maybe we have more Jesus on the cross in our churches. And, you know, the crucified Christ.
I'm sorry, Laura,
instead of-
your audio. Would you say that again? Your audio crapped out.
That Mark, I love going into a church that has crucified Christ on the cross. And I feel it's kind of whitewashed when you have just the cross, you know, I love the suffering Christ.
Yeah.
So, but some people are seems a lot of people are turned off by that.
Yeah, we may, and those of us that see it, maybe from where we are culturally, economically, and culturally, have to work sometimes a little harder to get what that means. You know. Okay. All right, folks. We'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.